The Flaxborough Flower and Produce Show had, for many years, been the highlight of that slow-moving calendar by which the town measured its own importance. There was the council's spring luncheon, the autumnal civic ball, and the flower show. Of these, the latter carried most weight because it combined two of Flaxborough's favourite pastimes, growing things in soil and criticising one another's efforts at it. The Hall of St. Swithin's had been transformed into an explosion of carnations, chrysanthemums and vegetables of such dimensions that the less charitable muttered about chemical aids. Tables groaned under onions as big as a curate's fist, and marrows that would have embarrassed a maiden aunt. Among the more conventional displays stood one which, though it had complied with the regulations, provoked from the earliest moment a steady trickle of commentary. This was the entry sponsored by Mr. Basil Grote, undertaker. He had elected to exhibit a coffin, not, it should be stressed, of functional timber and brass, but of flowers, white lilies and pale chrysanthemums forming the lid, and a neat edging of dark ivy suggesting the solemnity of its shape. It was both delicate and disconcerting, and many visitors, unwilling to be thought squeamish, pretended admiration while whispering their distaste the moment they moved along. Mrs. Enid Chubb, the vicar's wife, found herself unable to pass it without remarking to all within earshot that while she had no objection to funerals in their place, she did not see why they should be rehearsed in blooms among carrots and dahlias. Mr. Grote, bowing gravely beside his creation, murmured that death was part of nature's cycle, which made it eminently suitable. The remark gained him no friends. The incident, if it can be so called, occurred shortly before the prize-giving. A hush spread in ripples from the far corner of the hall, accompanied by the nervous flapping of a steward's programme. Mrs. Eveline Ransom, a lady of indeterminate age but determined opinions, had peered at the coffin arrangement, given a short squeak not unlike that of a stepped-on mouse, and collapsed into a chair. She was revived with smelling salts from a handbag more than equal to any emergency, and after a moment her eyes opened wide, full of agitation. "It isn't right," she whispered hoarsely. Not right at all. Pressed by solicitous acquaintances to clarify, she merely shook her head, muttering, "In there." "Oh, I know what I saw." What she claimed to have seen, however, proved elusive. By the time she had been shepherded away to the tea-stall, Mrs. Ransom had sunk into a state of vagueness, insisting only that the coffin display ought never to have been admitted. This, naturally, guaranteed that no one spoke of anything else for the rest of the afternoon. The judges, reluctant to offend either horticultural propriety or undertakerly dignity, awarded Mr. Grote a respectable second prize. The murmurs this provoked were not improved by his stiff bow of acknowledgment, which some interpreted as smugness. By evening, the talk in the snug of the compasses had reached the conclusion that there had been something in the coffin. What that something might be was variously reported as a doll, a mask, or in one particularly florid version, a severed hand. Mr. Grote himself walked home through the twilight, his tall hat balanced like a punctuation mark of solemnity. If he heard the sniggers from a pair of youths by the bus stop, he gave no sign. His thoughts were his own, though a close observer might have noticed the faintly hurried nature of his steps. Inspector Purbright did not attend the flower show, save occasionally when a duty called for civic presence. That evening, however, he received a telephone message from Superintendent Chubb, who thought he had better know of a small disturbance at St. Swithin's. Purbright listened, replied that he was grateful, and returned to the quiet business of marking timesheets. His face betrayed no more than a flicker of amusement. In Flaxborough, it was seldom the size of an event that mattered, but the vigour with which tongues wagged after it, and Purbright, who understood his town as a gardener understands the weeds, knew that a coffin of flowers and a lady's fainting fit would be enough to fertilize an entire season of gossip. The whisper had begun. By the following morning, the fainting of Mrs. Eveline Ransom had become the most reliable stimulant for conversation in Flaxborough since the town clerk's mislaid trousers during a council trip to Scarborough. News of it travelled not only by word of mouth, but by the peculiar osmosis of village life, in which every glance, cough, or hesitation could be interpreted as information. In the market square, where stalls of cabbages and knitted tea cosies coexisted with the more ambitious displays of cheap crockery, rumour achieved its customary velocity. Mrs. Spratt, who sold eggs of such variable size that customers treated them like a raffle, told her first purchaser that Eveline saw a face in the flowers, a real face, mind you, not one of them saintly imaginings. The next customer, overhearing, asked whether the face had been human or otherwise. Mrs. Spratt, affronted, would only say she had repeated exactly what was told to her by Mrs. Croot, who had it from the lady's niece, the niece in question, a pale girl who taught piano in the afternoons, was meanwhile assuring a greengrocer's assistant that her aunt had been too overcome to speak plainly, but had distinctly murmured the word ghastly. The assistant, in the manner of assistants everywhere, added embroidery when reporting the matter to his mother, who by lunch was describing to her bridge partners that Eveline Ransom had recognized someone inside the coffin of flowers. Recognized, she stressed, not merely imagined. The notion was compelling. To recognize a person was far more tantalizing than to glimpse a shape. Within hours, speculation had identified candidates. One was the late Mr. Ransom himself, though several objected on grounds that he had been disposed of with proper efficiency some 12 years earlier. Another was a neighbour with whom Eveline had quarrelled, and whose absence that morning from her customary seat at the bus stop required no further explanation in the minds of those who enjoy linking facts by the thinnest of threads. The compasses contributed its own variant. Here, over stout and dominoes, the version circulated that Mrs. Ransom had detected a threatening message, written, apparently, in petals of a different hue among the lilies. None could specify the words, but this proved no impediment to conviction. "A warning," declared Mr. Piggott, who prided himself on understanding such matters. "A warning to keep quiet, or else." Quiet about what, he did not attempt to define. In the genteel surroundings of Miss Teatley's tea-room, the interpretation took on a more romantic turn. The coffin was said to have contained a token from a long-forgotten lover of Eveline's, one who had perished tragically and whose memory had been enshrined in floral symbolism. This theory delighted the ladies who subscribed to it, for it lent their ordinary acquaintance a glamour of the tragic heroine. By mid-afternoon, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Chubb, had grown weary of hearing her own disapproving comment on the display returned to her in forms increasingly unrecognizable. She informed her husband that the matter should be put firmly to rest before the entire parish descended into hysteria. The vicar, who preferred not to intervene in anything less than a full schism, promised vaguely to consider it after evensong Mr. Grote, whose undertaking business had never before enjoyed so much attention, endured the scrutiny of customers and non-customers alike with an expression of glum dignity. To one inquisitive matron he observed that his floral coffin had been intended merely as a tribute to craftsmanship, and that if people saw ghosts therein, it was a reflection upon their imaginations, not upon his lilies. The matron replied with a sniff that undertakers ought to know better than to provoke hysteria in respectable women. Meanwhile, Mrs. Ransom herself had retreated to bed. The doctor, summoned more out of social obligation than necessity, diagnosed nervous shock aggravated by a disposition to melodrama. He prescribed rest, which was the one remedy she intended to ignore, for lying among pillows gave her audience ample scope to call and hear her gasping hints. She told Mrs. Croggins, the charwoman, that she could never repeat what she had seen lest it bring scandal upon the town. She told her niece that she might, one day, write it down for posterity, and she told herself, in the secrecy of her mind, that she was not altogether certain what she had seen, only that it had been sufficient to make her knees give way, which was proof enough of seriousness. Inspector Purbright, walking to his office from the station house, overheard fragments as he passed through the square. Blood in the blooms. Face behind the ivy. Some message to councillors. He did not pause, nor did he smile more than usual, but he made a mental note of the persistence with which nonsense travelled. It was a law of nature in Flaxborough that untruth had legs, while fact merely leaned on a stick. In his office later, Sergeant Love announced that he had been told by a cousin's wife that the coffin had contained a photograph. Purbright looked up mildly. "Of whom?" he asked. Love admitted the detail had been omitted. Purbright suggested that next time the cousin's wife might be encouraged to obtain the negative as well. Thus, as dusk fell, Flaxborough sat well fed on conjecture. Mrs. Ransom's swoon had become, by repetition and embellishment, not merely a fainting fit before a floral display, but the opening act of a mystery. And though no crime had yet been proved, the town had the agreeable sensation that one was in progress. Inspector Purbright believed in the value of listening. It was a habit that disarmed those who expected brisk interrogation, and it spared him the effort of inventing clever questions. Most people, if allowed the space, revealed far more than they intended, often while congratulating themselves on their discretion. The morning after Mrs. Ransom's dramatic collapse, Purbright decided to take a measured stroll through the places where tongues tended to wag most freely. He began with the Flower Show Committee secretary, a gaunt retired bank clerk named Mr. Liddon, who prided himself on record-keeping of such pedantry that he was capable of producing receipts for postage stamps purchased in 1938. Yes, perfectly in order, Liddon assured, tapping a file. Every exhibit entered with the correct form, duly signed, fees paid, no exceptions. He said this with the air of one who suspected Purbright of wanting to catch him in negligence. The inspector merely nodded, and Mr. Grote's contribution, he asked mildly. Liddon straightened, entirely within regulation. A floral arrangement, no more no less? Shape not prescribed. Were we to forbid coffins, next someone would claim we had outlawed arches. And what then of circles? Of spheres? It would be chaos. His voice quivered with the prospect. Purbright thanked him, asked about the judging, and left Liddon rehearsing his speech for the annual report. Next came a call at Grote's establishment. The undertaker, whose premises smelled of polished wood and faint carnations, received him with the strained courtesy of a man enduring scrutiny with clenched teeth. "You know what they are saying?" Grote muttered after the formalities. "That I smuggled some unholy thing beneath those blooms. A hand, a head, heaven knows what else. All nonsense." Purbright observed the tall, lugubrious man. And yet Mrs. Ransom fainted. Grote's long fingers drummed the counter. She has always been a lady of nerves. Once fainted at a christening because the baby looked unusually red. I ask you, is that reliable? Not always, Purbright agreed. He let the silence linger. Grote continued, unable to stop himself. The coffin's shape was symbolic, respectful. A reminder that even amid dahlias and jam, mortality remains. His tone, though dignified, carried the weary defensiveness of one who feared ridicule more than accusation. Purbright thanked him and admired a catalogue of wreaths before departing. At the tea-rooms, he found Mrs. Ransom herself, installed with cushions like an invalid queen. She brightened at his approach, for to be questioned by the inspector lent her swoon a consequence almost equal to martyrdom. I cannot describe it, she sighed, without trembling. But it was there, Inspector, there among the blossoms. The presence... I saw... She faltered theatrically. What did you see? Purbright asked, gentle as one might coax a hesitant child. A face, familiar yet dreadful, staring at me through the lilies. She pressed a hand to her bosom. I would not be surprised if it were a warning. I have been outspoken, you know. About certain people. Purbright asked which people, but she only lowered her eyes, a performance suggesting scandal too weighty for open air. Leaving her to her admirers, he walked towards the high street, where the florists were still sorting through wilted leftovers from the show. Miss Perks, who had provided the carnations, sniffed when asked about Groat's entry. Taste, Inspector, that's the thing. And some have none. I said to myself, a coffin of chrysanthemums will only make folk think of funerals. But Mr. Groat insists on being original. She paused, narrowing her eyes. Though someone tampered with it, I noticed the ivy wasn't his tying. Too clumsy. Did you mention this? Not aloud. But I know my knots, Inspector. That ribbon was not Groat's, this small remark Purbright tucked quietly into memory. Trivial perhaps, but it was in trifles that people's masks tended to slip. At the police station later, he shared tea with Sergeant Love, who was eager to report. My aunt's neighbour swears Mrs. Ransom has been feuding with Groat since her husband's burial. Something about the wrong hymn sheet. She says Eveline never forgave him, Purbright sipped. Resentment makes a long companion, Love nodded solemnly, though it was doubtful he followed the thought further than the surface. The afternoon ended with Purbright visiting Mrs. Flegg, the caretaker of St. Swithin's Hall. She was brisk, red-armed and unimpressed with mysteries. All I know is there was a mess of petals on the floor after, and some ribbon torn. Folk making out it was a ghost. Ghosts don't drop litter, she sniffed. If you ask me, someone's trying to make trouble for Groat. He's gloomy enough, but he minds his own. Walking back through the town, Purbright reflected. Gossip, grievance, taste, and petty resentments. Flaxborough's soil was fertile indeed, yet somewhere among the exaggerations and sighs was a detail worth holding on to, the ribbon that did not belong. For now he kept his thoughts to himself. The town would talk itself breathless. He would listen, as always, until the words revealed more than their speakers intended. Flaxborough prided itself on its ability to make decisions swiftly, so long as they concerned matters of no consequence. By the third day after the flower show, the town's respectable element had agreed upon a satisfactory culprit, Mr. Basil Groat, undertaker. The Flaxborough Citizen, which relied for its substance on the recycling of parish minutes and the occasional lost cat notice, devoted a column to the Coffin affair under the headline, Tasteless display upsets lady visitor. The article described Mrs. Ransom as well-known and widely respected, and noted her collapse had been brought on by a grotesque and ill-judged exhibit. It did not state directly that Mr. Groat had smuggled anything into the flowers, but the implication was as visible as a watermark. Councillor Harbottle, chairman of the Horticultural Committee, read the report over breakfast and found it entirely to his liking. That should settle it, he announced to his wife. Groat has embarrassed the committee, and embarrassment must be punished. He had, in fact, been nursing a grievance against the undertaker since a funeral 4 months earlier, when Groat had failed to supply sufficient folding chairs. Others were quick to adopt the conclusion. The vicar's wife repeated her original observation with the quiet satisfaction of a prophet vindicated. Mrs. Spratt at her egg stall remarked that Groat had a morbid streak, always did. Even Miss Perks, whose carnations had adorned the coffin, suggested that while her blooms were beyond reproach, they had been tainted by association. By the time Inspector Purbright received a visit from Councillor Harbottle, armed with indignation and a sheaf of clippings, the consensus was solid. You see, Inspector, the town is united, Harbottle declared, planting himself opposite Purbright's desk. There is no need for prolonged inquiry. The fellow acted with disgraceful bad taste, and the result was Mrs. Ransom's collapse. He ought to be censured, struck off future shows at the very least. Purbright regarded him with mild courtesy. Censured for flowers, Councillor? I am not sure that falls under police jurisdiction. Come, Inspector. The public is alarmed. My wife refuses to pass his premises, and the citizen has been obliged to warn the town. You must take steps. Purbright's pencil tapped the blotter. What steps do you recommend? Prosecution under the unlawful arrangement of Lily's act? His tone was so even that Harbottle missed the edge entirely. "I am serious, Inspector." "So am I," said Purbright, though his eyes contained a flicker of amusement. "The law, alas, does not cover poor taste. Nor, in my experience, do fainting fits generally amount to evidence." Harbottle reddened. "Then what do you intend to do?" "What I usually do. Listen, wait, and see if facts emerge." The councillor departed in disgust, muttering about bureaucratic obstruction. Later that afternoon, Purbright found himself summoned by Superintendent Chubb, who was sympathetic to Harbottle's impatience. "We can't have this dragging on, Purbright." "Bad for public confidence. People want reassurance." "Confidence in what?" asked Purbright mildly. "In the authorities." "And what would reassure them more, by your premature conclusion or the truth?" Chubb coughed, as though truth were an optional extra. "Still, the undertaker looks a fair suspect." "Odd fellow." "Grimtrade. Doesn't smile much." Purbright reflected that if professions were to be measured by smiles, the police would fare no better. He left the office with a quiet sigh. That evening, Mr. Grote endured a deputation. 3 members of the Flower Show Committee appeared at his premises, their expressions grave with civic duty. They informed him that while no rule had been broken, the committee could not overlook the distress caused. Grote, stiff with mortification, bowed and said only that he regretted any lady's discomfort. When word of his supposed admission circulated, it was received as confession. By breakfast next morning, half the town was certain Grote had admitted to smuggling some grotesque article beneath the blooms. Mrs. Ransom, delighted to find her status elevated to that of principal witness, declared from her sofa that she would never again attend a flower show while Grote remained in practice. She was visited by well-wishers who treated her account as holy writ. "It was a face," she insisted, though the details shifted depending on audience. Sometimes male, sometimes female, always dreadful. Against this mounting tide, Purbright maintained his usual stillness. He paid a second call on Grote, who looked more harried than before. "They want to ruin me," Grote muttered. "For years I've kept quiet, done my work, caused no trouble. Now they whisper that I placed horrors among the chrysanthemums. Why would I? My business is solemn enough without theatrics." Purbright asked if anyone had access to the display after it was assembled. "Anyone," Grote replied bitterly. The hall was open half the morning. Stewards, exhibitors, gawkers, any of them could have fiddled with the ribbons. "I tied them neat, Inspector, neat as I always do." "But later I saw one hanging loose." "Not mine." The inspector's eyes rested on him. "You mentioned nothing of this before," Grote grimaced. "Because I knew what they'd say, that I was inventing excuses. Better to keep silent. But silence has done me no good. When Purbright left, the undertaker stood in his doorway, thin as a lamp-post against the darkening street, a figure half caricature, half tragedy. Back at the station, Sergeant Love reported with satisfaction that most of the town had Grote down for it. He seemed to regard this unanimity as evidence in itself. Purbright, without looking up from his papers, remarked that when everyone agreed too quickly, it was usually wise to wonder why. The convenient suspect had been chosen. Flaxborough could sleep easy, comforted by the belief that blame was tidily allocated. Only Purbright, in his quiet office, knew that convenience seldom coincided with truth. The town might have been satisfied with Mr. Grote as its culprit, but Inspector Purbright had long ceased to confuse satisfaction with accuracy. Convenience, he knew, was a poor substitute for truth, and truth had a habit of lingering in the smallest details. Details most people were too impatient to notice. One such detail came to his attention. On a damp Tuesday afternoon, when he called again at St. Swithin's Hall, now returned to its usual dreary business of jumble sales and parish meetings, Mrs. Flegg, the caretaker, was scraping dried wax from the floor while humming tunelessly. "I'm clearing up after them show folk," she told Purbright, without pausing. "Always leave behind a mess of pins and petals." "Enough to choke the vacuum," Purbright crouched to examine a corner where a handful of faded chrysanthemums still clung to a ribbon. The ribbon was a curious thing, purple satin, frayed at one edge, tied into a knot that lacked the neatness he had come to associate with Grote's handiwork. Grote, as he had said himself, was a man who tied things neat. "This wasn't here during the judging?" Purbright asked. Mrs. Flegg shook her head. "No, Inspector. I swept that corner twice on the day. This was dropped later. And I don't say by who, though I've me suspicions." When prompted, she muttered about a councillor's wife who had been loitering after the prizes were handed out, but she offered no proof. Purbright pocketed the ribbon with careful discretion. Later he visited Miss Perks, the florist, who confirmed his suspicion. "That's not Grote's," she said firmly, after a brief examination. "He ties flat bows, always. This one's twisted wrong. Besides, he uses black, not purple." "I'd swear on my carnations," the inspector thanked her, leaving her glowing with the satisfaction of expert testimony. It was often enough to ask people about matters they felt confident upon. They would give you far more than you asked for. That evening, Purbright dined modestly at his lodgings, reflecting on the ribbon. A trivial thing, to be sure, a scrap of satin in a town awash with scraps of gossip. Yet it was the only object, thus far, that spoke with the calmness of fact rather than rumour. Mrs. Ransom's fainting fit might have been sincere or staged. Grote's dignity might be genuine or defensive. Harbottle's outrage might be civic-minded or self-serving. But a ribbon did not swoon, protest, or exaggerate. It merely existed out of place. The next morning, Purbright strolled along the high street. He noticed how many shopkeepers now turned conversation to the coffin business within moments. A butcher declared that Grote had always looked shifty, while the draper hinted that the undertaker's accounts were less tidy than his knots. Purbright listened, smiling faintly, but filed none of it as evidence. At the police station, Sergeant Love was eager with a new development. "Someone left this at the desk," he reported, producing an envelope. Inside lay another ribbon, this one black, folded carefully. Said it belonged to Grote. Proof of something, apparently. Purbright examined it. Black indeed, and tied with precision. "Neat," he murmured. Then, after a pause, "Who left it?" Love hesitated. Didn't catch the name. Just a fellow in a hurry. Seemed respectable. Respectable, Purbright thought, was the most misleading description known to Englishmen. It covered more sins than it revealed. He placed the envelope in a drawer and closed it quietly. That afternoon, he visited Mrs. Ransom again. She received him with the air of a martyr entertaining royalty. "I cannot sleep for thinking of it," she confided. "That dreadful sight in the coffin." "Nightmares, Inspector. Every night." Purbright asked whether she recalled anything besides the face. "Perhaps an object, a colour, a ribbon." Mrs. Ransom frowned delicately. "Now you mention it, yes. There was a flash of purple. Shocking, garish purple among the lilies. Quite unsuitable." It made me dizzy. This admission interested him far more than her face of horror. A ribbon was real. A vision could be fancied. He thanked her politely and departed before she could embroider further. That evening, he allowed himself a slow walk by the river. The town lay quiet, its windows glowing with the complacency of gossip, satisfied. Yet Purbright felt the unease of a puzzle not quite fitting. Someone had introduced that purple ribbon. Someone had wanted Mrs. Ransom, or the town through her, to think the coffin display contained something sinister. But who and why? He recalled Mrs. Flegg's suspicion of a councillor's wife. He recalled Miss Perks's pride in detecting knots. He recalled Grote's weary insistence that the ribbons had been tampered with. A small detail, yes. But it was often in the smallest threads that a whole tapestry came undone. The purple ribbon, though small enough to be dismissed by most as a trifle, had begun to cast its own quiet shadow over Inspector Purbright's inquiry. It was, after all, an intruder, not Grote's ribbon, not Grote's knot, and yet undeniably part of Grote's display. Someone had wanted it there, to discover who might benefit. Purbright turned his gaze from the obvious to the less conspicuous figures of Flaxborough society, those who lived in the penumbra of respectability, outwardly proper, yet inwardly entangled in petty disputes. His first visit that week was to Councillor Harbottle, who received him in a sitting-room that smelled of polish and anxiety. The councillor had not forgiven Purbright for failing to censure Grote immediately, and his greeting was frosty. "Still no progress, Inspector?" he asked, with the air of a man whose patience was not infinite. "Progress is often slow when facts are scarce," Purbright replied. His gaze wandered to a sewing basket by the fire. A length of purple ribbon, not unlike the one in his pocket, curled from it. Harbottle's wife, bustling in with a tray of oversweet biscuits, caught his glance. "That's mine," she said quickly. "For trimming hats. Not evidence of anything, Inspector," Purbright smiled mildly. "Hats are seldom criminal, Mrs. Harbottle, though they have been provocative in history." He let the remark drift away, but not before noticing her tightening lips. Next he sought out Mrs. Flegg, the caretaker. She had her own opinions, as always, and offered them with relish. "I'll tell you who doesn't like Grote," she said, scrubbing furiously at a brass doorknob. "That widow, Mrs. Penrith, lost her husband 2 years back, and she's still sour about the coffin being too narrow," blamed Grote, though the man was stout as a hogshead. "If anyone would put something nasty in his flowers, she would." Purbright listened without interruption. Resentment, like mildew, grew best in dark corners. He found Mrs. Penrith in her neat parlour, draped heavily with lace and memories. She was a handsome woman in her 40s, with eyes sharp as tacks. "Grote?" she repeated when asked. "A solemn stick of a man. My poor Edgar deserved better." "They had to squeeze him like a bolster," Purbright murmured sympathy. "I wouldn't put mischief past Grote," she continued. "Too much pride in his lilies." "But there are others in this town who could do with a shaking. Councillors, for one, always pretending to standards while hiding their own slips." Her words were edged with the satisfaction of one who savours scandal. Purbright thanked her and left her gazing with relish at the thought of municipal disgrace. Meanwhile, Miss Perks, the florist, had her own grievance. When Purbright called again, she confided that Grote had undercut her once at a funeral order. Said he'd provide blooms at cost just to get the custom. "That's not business, Inspector. That's robbery. And did you ever mention this to anyone?" Purbright asked. "Mention? I shouted it in the market square. But nobody listens. They all think Grote so dignified." "Ha!" She sniffed and arranged her roses with unnecessary force. Purbright noted it. Resentment again, dressed up as indignation. At the station that evening, Sergeant Love produced further tidings. "Heard from my cousin's lodger that Councillor Harbottle's accounts are queer. Owes money all round. If Grote knows about it, well, that could explain why someone wants him discredited." Purbright considered. Money, pride, grievances. Each motive was plausible, each as human as the smell of boiled cabbage that pervaded half the town. The question was not whether people had reasons, but which reason had sprouted into action. That night, as rain tapped against his window, Purbright sat at his desk and sorted his impressions. Harbottle pompous and indebted. His wife, with her hat ribbons, Mrs. Penrith, still bitter over coffin dimensions. Miss Perks, jealous of business. Each respectable, each full of complaints, each capable of mischief cloaked as propriety. He thought of the purple ribbon again. A trivial object, yet it carried weight because it had been chosen, placed deliberately. Someone had wanted to suggest corruption in Grote's flowers. Someone had wanted Mrs. Ransom to swoon and the town to talk. Respectability was a costume, Purbright reflected. Beneath it lay envy, spite, and the quiet hunger for revenge. And in Flaxborough, costumes were worn so convincingly that even their owners often forgot they were disguises. The inspector closed his notebook, switched off the lamp, and allowed himself a small smile. Shadows of respectability, yes, but shadows, when watched long enough, revealed the shapes that cast them. It was on the following Sunday, beneath the steady chime of St. Swithin's bells, that Flaxborough's Coffin affair acquired a darker tone. The morning service had been well attended, partly because it was Harvest Thanksgiving, and partly because many parishioners wished to see how Mrs. Ransom would conduct herself after her celebrated collapse. She did not disappoint, arriving with her niece in tow and a scarf tied dramatically about her head, as though recovery from a swoon required insulation from draughts. The congregation, fortified with hymnals and curiosity, was in no mood for distraction until a commotion began near the north aisle. A cluster of children sent to retrieve additional prayer books returned instead with faces pale and eyes wide. "There's something in the coffin," one whispered, and soon enough, half the pews were twisting round to look. The coffin was there still, or rather its remains. Grote's floral display had been brought from the hall and placed in a side chapel as part of the decorations. Its once proud lilies now drooped, browned at the edges, and the chrysanthemums had lost their freshness. Yet among the wilted blooms lay an object that had most certainly not been present during the flower show. It was a pair of spectacles, round, thick-lensed, and smeared unmistakably with something that looked like blood. A gasp spread through the church like a chill wind. The vicar faltered mid-sentence, then cleared his throat and tried valiantly to resume his homily on gratitude. But the eyes of his flock were fixed not on him, but on the floral coffin and the sinister offering within. Mrs. Ransom, naturally, was the first to declare herself vindicated. "You see," she cried, half rising from her pew, "I said there was something dreadful. Now perhaps you will believe me." She was urged back into her seat by her niece, but the effect was achieved. Every whisper, every doubt of her story was swept away in a tide of confirmation. After the service, the congregation streamed out into the churchyard, buzzing with speculation. Theories multiplied like midges. Some swore the spectacles belonged to Mr. Grote himself, evidence of some ghastly ritual. Others claimed they were Mrs. Penrith's late husband's, planted to remind the town of his mistreatment. A few went further, suggesting the blood upon them was fresh, and that a terrible crime had been committed overnight. Inspector Purbright, who had been present in the rear pew, walked calmly forward to inspect the offending object. He lifted the spectacles with a handkerchief and regarded them with his usual mild expression. "They are old," he remarked to Sergeant Love, who hovered anxiously beside him. "Scratched, frames slightly bent. Blood, if it is blood, is dry. Then, they're not new?" Love asked, somewhat disappointed. "Not new, no. Nor, I think, carelessly dropped. They were placed quite deliberately to be discovered." The superintendent arrived in a flurry, summoned from his Sunday roast. He surveyed the scene with the irritation of a man whose digestion had been interrupted. "This is going too far, Purbright. First ribbons, now spectacles. Someone is making a fool of us." "Perhaps not of us," Purbright replied gently, "but certainly of someone." The spectacles were carried off for examination, though Purbright knew already they would yield little. Objects chosen for display in such dramas were seldom traceable. Their value lay not in what they were, but in what people imagined them to mean, and Flaxborough's imagination was running unchecked. By evening the pubs were alive with confident declarations. Mr. Grote was accused not only of ghoulish taste, but of criminality. His funeral parlour was said to be a front for sinister experiments. One inventive soul proposed that the spectacles had belonged to a long-missing clerk from the borough offices. Grote himself endured a hostile stare from every passer-by. When Purbright called upon him that night, the undertaker's face was ashen. "They will destroy me, Inspector." A man cannot run a business when customers cross the street to avoid him. "Those spectacles, I have never seen them before in my life." "You must believe me." "I believe you have not placed them," Purbright said evenly. "The question is who did. And why? Groat sank into a chair. Why me? Why always me? Purbright studied him. Because you make a convenient suspect. Because you are solemn and your trade is grave. And because someone wishes the town to believe you unwholesome. Groat looked up with hollow eyes. But what have I done to deserve it? Purbright did not answer. He knew too well that in Flaxborough, deserving had little to do with it. Old grudges, debts, and rivalries seldom required reason to find expression. That night, Mrs. Ransom once again held court, her fainting now crowned with prophetic triumph. She told all who visited that she had known something worse would follow, that she had been chosen to bear witness. The bloodied spectacles were, to her mind, proof that evil forces walked in Flaxborough. To her admirers, it was proof that Eveline Ransom possessed uncommon discernment. Purbright, meanwhile, considered the event with more caution. A second incident, deliberate and theatrical, had escalated the affair from gossip to scandal. Someone had crossed from whispers to action. The purple ribbon could be dismissed as a prank, perhaps, but spectacles, bloodied, placed in a church. That was a declaration. He stood that night by his window, gazing at the quiet roofs of Flaxborough. Behind those curtains were men and women outwardly respectable, inwardly festering with small grudges. Which of them, he wondered, had chosen to turn spite into performance? The town, comforted by its neat suspicion of Mr. Groat, would not look further. But Purbright would, for he knew better than most that when shadows lengthened in Flaxborough, it was rarely the obvious figure that cast them. The affair of the bloodied spectacles did not so much shock Flaxborough as excite it. Horror was too strong an emotion for the town. Curiosity laced with indignation was its natural state. By Monday morning the markets hummed with speculation, dressed up as certainty, and even the postman, normally a silent fellow, carried with his letters a packet of theories. Inspector Purbright, however, moved with his usual calm. He had seen before how swiftly outrage could swell and subside, like rainwater in a gutter. The trick was to step aside and watch the flow, not to be carried off by it. That afternoon he sat in his office with the spectacles on his desk, turning them slowly between his fingers. They were ordinary enough, scratched from long use, one arm bent slightly. Yet they had been chosen carefully. Whoever placed them had understood the psychology of Flaxborough. Give people a token, and they would invent the rest. Sergeant Love watched uneasily. "Looks like blood, sir. People say it's proof." "Proof of what?" Purbright asked. Love frowned. "That Groat's guilty." Purbright shook his head. "Proof that someone once Groat thought guilty, perhaps. Nothing more." When the sergeant departed, Purbright leaned back and allowed his thoughts to wander. He had always believed that human nature, rather than evidence, solved most crimes. Forensic science, useful though it was, had little purchase in Flaxborough. Here people betrayed themselves not with fingerprints, but with habits, with jealousies, with the small, careless slips of character that no glove could cover. Respectability, he mused, was the town's proudest possession. It was worn like a well-pressed suit, neat and convincing to the casual glance. Yet beneath it seethed envy, spite, and hunger for gossip. The undertaker, Groat, made an easy target precisely because his trade reminded others of the truth they preferred to avoid, that mortality stalked behind every front garden and every lace curtain. It was convenient to treat him as the villain, but who gained by it? That was the question. The spectacles, like the purple ribbon, were not random mischief. They were staged, set pieces in a performance designed to humiliate Groat and confirm the town's fears. Someone had invested effort in ensuring the scandal grew. Purbright rose and crossed to the window. The square outside lay in drizzle, its shop sagging beneath the weight of routine. Mrs. Spratt fussed over her egg stall. A young clerk hurried under an umbrella. A policeman pedalled past with his cape flapping like tired wings. Ordinary life, yet within it motives curled like smoke. He thought of Councillor Harbottle, burdened with debts, eager to deflect attention. He thought of Mrs. Harbottle with her ribbons and tight lips, of Mrs. Penrith, sharp with grievance, of Miss Perks, jealous in trade, each clothed in virtue, each nursing injuries invisible to the eye, but tender to the touch. Human nature was predictable in the main. People lied to protect pride, to punish rivals, or simply to enjoy the delicious sensation of being part of a scandal. What fascinated Purbright was not the existence of these motives, they were everywhere, but the point at which they broke free of talk and turned into action. Who, among Flaxborough's gallery of ordinary malcontents, had chosen to make the leap from whisper to spectacle? That evening, over a supper of cold meat and pickles, Purbright allowed himself the indulgence of a small smile. He had always admired the ingenuity with which small-town spite disguised itself. In the city, crime might be brutal, born of desperation. In Flaxborough, it was theatrical, clothed in roses, ribbons, and spectacles. The cruelty lay not in violence, but in humiliation, in ensuring the victim felt exposed to the smirks of neighbours. He thought of Mrs. Ransom basking in her newfound importance. She had become the oracle of the affair, her fainting transformed into prophecy. Was she manipulated or complicit? Perhaps both. People often embraced the roles that flattery offered them. Purbright poured himself tea and considered the spectacles once more. Their very ordinariness intrigued him. They had belonged to someone in Flaxborough, he was certain of it. The scratches, the bent arm, signs of long familiarity. Whoever planted them had drawn from personal possession, not some anonymous discard. That narrowed the field. He imagined the culprit, sitting in a neat parlour, selecting the item with care, wiping the lenses with slow fingers, dabbing them with a smear of something dark to suggest horror. Then, with nerves steeled by indignation or malice, slipping them among the drooping flowers where the congregation would find them. A stage set prepared for maximum effect. Human nature, Purbright reflected again, was never content with quiet resentment. It yearned for an audience, and Flaxborough, ever hungry for a drama that cost it nothing, was the perfect stage. Later, that night, he wrote in his notebook a single line, "Objects tell us who wishes to be believed." Then he closed the book and allowed himself the faintest sigh. He had no need yet to confront anyone. The town would talk itself weary, and in the talk something careless would escape. It always did. For now he would watch, listen, and wait for the masks of respectability to slip further. They always did. Inspector Purbright had long ago discovered that truth seldom emerged under pressure. It preferred to slip out during conversation, half hidden in the folds of manners. A polite remark, carefully chosen, could unsettle the guilty more effectively than a dozen accusations. Thus it was that he contrived to attend the council's tea-gathering the following Thursday. Officially, it was a routine affair, an opportunity for the borough's notables to drink weak Darjeeling from sturdy cups and remind themselves of their civic importance. Unofficially, it was the perfect stage upon which Purbright might test his suspicions. The room smelled faintly of damp overcoats and sponge cake. Councillor Harbottle presided with his usual pomposity, while his wife fussed over the distribution of teaspoons. Mrs. Penrith, draped in black as though still fresh from mourning, conversed acidly with Miss Perks, the florist. Mrs. Ransom, determined not to be excluded, had secured an invitation through sheer force of notoriety and sat radiating self-importance from a corner. Purbright moved gently among them, listening, nodding, allowing them to display their grievances like blooms at a horticultural show. Harbottle boasted of committee efficiency. Miss Perks complained of funeral orders. Mrs. Ransom reminded anyone who would listen of her fainting fit. It was a chorus of vanity, envy, and self-regard, all dressed in lace and biscuits. When the tea had settled and conversation had grown repetitive, Purbright chose his moment. He stood near the hearth, cup in hand, and spoke as though to no one in particular. "It is curious," he said mildly, "how much may be told by a knot. Undertakers, for example, tie their ribbons with a precision born of practice. A loose or twisted knot suggests another hand entirely." The effect was immediate. Most guests smiled vaguely, unsure why the inspector had raised so trivial a subject. Miss Perks laughed too loudly, declaring she could identify her own bows in a gale. Mrs. Penrith sniffed and said nothing, but Mrs. Harbottle across the room started as though stung. Her cup rattled against its saucer, tea slopped onto her glove. She recovered quickly, dabbing at the stain with her napkin, yet her husband's irritated frown betrayed that the slip had been noticed. Purbright observed the moment without comment, allowing the conversation to resume its flow. The guilty seldom confessed outright. They betrayed themselves in tremors and overcorrections. Later, as plates of crumbling Battenberg circulated, he tried another thread. Spectacles, too, are distinctive. One can often tell their owner by the scratches, the bend of the frame. A very personal thing to plant among flowers. Again, most treated the remark as idle talk. But this time it was Councillor Harbottle who shifted in his seat, tugging at his collar. Mrs. Harbottle's eyes flickered towards him, then quickly away. Mrs. Ransom, seizing the chance to restore attention, launched into a fresh recital of her vision at the show, but Purbright barely heard her. He was watching the Harbottles. When the gathering ended, guests dispersing into the drizzle with umbrellas raised like surrender flags, Purbright lingered by the doorway. Mrs. Harbottle approached him, face tight. "You are fond of puzzles, Inspector," she said coolly, "but perhaps you see more than is really there." "Perhaps," Purbright agreed. His tone was as gentle as ever, but his eyes remained steady. Yet puzzles do tend to solve themselves once the pieces are placed together. She inclined, her head stiffly and swept away, her husband following like a man dragged by invisible reins. Back at the station, Sergeant Love was waiting with news of no consequence, a missing bicycle later discovered propped against its owner's shed. Purbright listened, nodded, and filed the matter away. His mind, however, remained with the tea gathering, with a rattling cup and a nervous glance. He knew better than to act hastily. Accusation without certainty would only harden defences. But the Harbottles had reacted, and reaction was the beginning of revelation. The ribbon, the spectacles, the need to see Grote disgraced, all might yet be drawn together. That night, Purbright wrote in his notebook, "Respectability flinches when touched." It was enough for now. The town, meanwhile, slumbered content in its suspicion of Grote. Mrs. Ransom basked in attention. Miss Perks sharpened her gossip. Mrs. Penrith rehearsed grievances. Only Purbright, in his quiet lodgings, considered how far malice would go when disguised as civic duty. A test, after all, was not meant to provide the answer. It was meant to shake loose the mask, to reveal the nervous twitch beneath, and Purbright had seen it, just enough to know which shadows to watch more closely. The council chamber was never designed for drama. Its heavy oak tables and stiff-backed chairs belonged to an age when civic duty was measured by the volume of paperwork rather than the fervour of debate. Yet on that Thursday evening, under the glare of electric lamps and the fidgeting of councillors, it became the unlikely stage for Inspector Purbright's quiet performance. The occasion was a routine meeting, ostensibly to discuss repairs to the town clock. But half the councillors were more preoccupied with the Coffin scandal, which by now had grown from gossip into a matter of municipal dignity. Superintendent Chubb, seated uncomfortably beside Purbright, had urged him beforehand to say something calming for pity's sake, or we'll be laughed out of the county. Purbright, however, was not interested in calming anyone. He was interested in telling the truth. When the business of clock maintenance had been dispatched, he rose. His manner was unhurried, his voice mild. "I wonder," he began, "if I might trouble the meeting with a few observations regarding the recent disturbances." At once, silence settled. Even the town clerk, who had been sketching a ship in the margin of his minutes, straightened. Purbright continued, "It is clear that certain objects, a ribbon, a pair of spectacles, have been introduced into Mr. Groat's floral display. Their purpose was not decoration, their purpose was to create scandal." Murmurs travelled round the chamber. Harbottle shifted in his seat. His wife, present as observer, looked fixedly at the ceiling. Purbright went on, still gentle. "Now we must ask who had reason to place them. Not Mr. Groat, who gained only humiliation. Not Mrs. Ransom, whose fainting fit, though sincere enough, was prompted by surprise. No, these items were chosen and placed by someone wishing to discredit Groat, to direct suspicion neatly upon him." He reached into his case and produced the purple ribbon, laying it on the table. "This knot," he said, "was not Groat's. He ties his bows flat and precise. This was hurried, twisted. A woman's knot, most likely. And indeed, one I happened to see among a basket of hat trimmings." All eyes turned towards Mrs. Harbottle, whose face coloured a delicate shade of plum. She opened her mouth, closed it, and reached for her handbag as if it might provide sanctuary. Before she could speak, Purbright raised the spectacles. "And these?" Scratched, bent, very particular, not plucked at random, but chosen. "I have seen Councillor Harbottle polish them with his own hand and on occasion misplace them. They are yours, Councillor, are they not?" A stunned silence followed. Harbottle sputtered, reached instinctively to his pocket, found it empty. "They were stolen," he managed at last. "Someone must have—" Purbright inclined his head politely. "Stolen, perhaps, yet placed with purpose. The ribbon and the spectacles together made a statement. A coffin adorned not with flowers, but with symbols." Symbols meant to suggest hidden shame. Why? Because Groat's business, though solemn, is steady. Certain persons, weighed by debts and irritated by grievances, might prefer that dignity disturbed, might prefer gossip to grow so thick that neighbours no longer trusted him. In short, discredit the undertaker and distract the town. The councillors shifted uneasily. Chubb wiped his forehead. Mrs. Ransom, thrilled, whispered to her niece that she had known it all along. Purbright allowed the silence to stretch before concluding. The purple ribbon was placed by Mrs. Harbottle, the spectacles by Councillor Harbottle. Between them, they sought to stir scandal, to ensure that tongues wagged and Groat bore the weight of suspicion. Whether from malice, from debt, or from sheer vanity, the act was the same. They staged a spectacle, and nearly succeeded. Mrs. Harbottle let out a gasp. I only wished to remind people of decency." "That dreadful coffin, indeed," Purbright said softly. "And in seeking to remind them, you nearly destroyed an innocent man. Respectability can be as cruel as malice when wielded so." Harbottle blustered, but his wife's downcast eyes betrayed the truth. The chamber buzzed with whispers, a chorus of shock tinged with satisfaction. Nothing delighted Flaxborough more than a fall from grace, especially when it involved those who had prided themselves most on their virtue. Superintendent Chubb cleared his throat heavily. "Well now, unpleasant business all told. I think the council will wish to deliberate in private." Purbright gathered his papers, bowed politely, and stepped away from the table. He had no interest in punishments. Such matters were for others. What mattered to him was clarity, the neat arrangement of facts into their rightful order. And that, at least, had been achieved. As he left the chamber, he heard Mrs. Ransom's voice behind him, raised in triumphant tones. "You see, I told you it was a face! I told you!" He smiled faintly, knowing her memory of the event would forever place her at the center of the drama, facts notwithstanding. Outside, the evening air was cool, the lamps casting long reflections upon the cobblestones. Purbright paused, breathed, and allowed the quiet to wash away the murmur of the chamber. In the end, there was nothing extraordinary about Flaxborough's scandals. They were simply the oldest story of all: vanity, pride, and the fear of being thought less respectable than one's neighbour. The scandal of the floral coffin ebbed, as all Flaxborough scandals did, not with resolution, but with fatigue. People grew weary of discussing the Harbottles, not because their downfall lacked savour, but because other, fresher morsels of gossip beckoned. By the following week, attention had shifted to the rumour that the fishmonger's daughter was engaged to a travelling salesman of uncertain prospects. Still, the matter of the ribbon and spectacles left its traces. Councillor Harbottle retained his position, for resignation would have been unthinkable, but his authority was clipped. Colleagues listened with polite boredom where once they had nodded gravely. His wife appeared less often at public gatherings, her hat trimmings conspicuously plain. The Harbottles continued to insist that their intentions had been misunderstood, though in quieter moments they admitted to each other that respectability was harder to recover than to flaunt. Mr. Basil Grote, meanwhile, returned to his undertaker's duties with a mixture of relief and bitterness. Customers still regarded him with solemn suspicion, but business, being inevitable, did not falter. If anything, the notoriety lent him a certain grim distinction. "There goes Grote," people whispered. "The man at the centre of it all." He bore it with stoicism, his tall hat as rigid as ever, though Purbright suspected he nursed a private satisfaction at outlasting his detractors. As for Mrs. Ransom, her role as prophetess of doom gave her more social power than she had ever known. She recounted her fainting fit with embellishments so elaborate that the event bore little resemblance to the original. Now she claimed not only to have seen a face in the coffin, but to have heard whispers beneath its lid, voices warning of retribution. The detail was greeted with awe by those inclined to romance, and indulgent smiles by those who knew her too well. Either way, she enjoyed her celebrity. In the tea rooms, Miss Perks rehearsed with relish how she had identified the knot as not Grote's. Mrs. Penrith, in turn, declared herself unsurprised by the Harbottle's disgrace, hinting darkly at secrets she might reveal when the time was right. Flaxborough's chorus of petty triumphs carried on, each voice adjusting the tale to flatter its own foresight. Inspector Purbright, for his part, did not join the discussion. He considered the matter closed once the truth had been aired in the council chamber. Whether the Harbottles faced censure or sympathy was immaterial to him. His task was not to punish, but to untangle, and that he had done. Still, he could not help but reflect upon the ease with which two respectable people had turned grievance into spectacle. A ribbon, a pair of spectacles. So ordinary, yet wielded with enough malice to set an entire town murmuring. He thought again of human nature, its hunger for attention, its envy, its fear of humiliation. In Flaxborough, these instincts rarely led to murder, but they caused wounds all the same. Wounds measured in reputation rather than blood. One evening, as he tidied the last of his notes, Sergeant Love entered with his usual earnestness. "Funny how it all came down to little things," Love remarked. "Bit of ribbon, a pair of glasses. Hardly worth the fuss," Purbright smiled. "It is the little things, Sergeant, that people notice most. Grand crimes alarm them, but trifles they can understand. And when they understand, they cannot resist talking. Love considered this, his brow furrowed. Suppose that's true, sir. Still, I'd have thought spectacles were meant to help you see clearer, not cause bother. The inspector chuckled softly, then dismissed him with a nod. In the weeks that followed, Flaxborough's rhythms resumed their familiar pace. The market square rang with gossip of new scandals. The church held its harvest festival untroubled by floral coffins, and the Citizen filled its columns with the dull comfort of council minutes. Life went on, as it always did, stitched together by propriety, frayed quietly by pettiness. One afternoon, Purbright walked along the riverbank, the sun low and mellow. He thought of the Harbottles sitting stiffly in their drawing-room, each blaming the other in silence. He thought of Grote, bowing gravely as he arranged lilies, his dignity both his armour and his prison. He thought of Mrs. Ransom, thriving on the drama she had half invented. All were ordinary, all were ridiculous, all entirely human. That was Flaxborough's charm. Its crimes were seldom monstrous, only magnified by gossip until they looked monstrous. And his task, patient, polite, persistent, was merely to sweep aside the theatre, leaving the small, sober truth behind. Back in his office, he filed the case away and reached for the next stack of paperwork. The forms were dull, the ink blotched, the handwriting inconsistent, yet he welcomed the routine. Drama was for the townsfolk. For Purbright, satisfaction lay in the quiet order of facts restored. He set his pen neatly on the blotter, leaned back in his chair, and allowed himself the faintest smile. Life in Flaxborough, he knew, would soon provide another puzzle. They always did.